It's amazing how the church fills up when you've got your back to it. Good morning. Happy New Year. Goeie nuwe jaar for those who go that way. And bonne année. I found out yesterday or the day before someone told me bonne année. So, Happy New Year to everyone. We do wonder though, is it a Happy New Year? You notice it's been a bit of a peculiar year. You know, the Chinese have a curse. One way around. There's a Chinese curse apparently. And if they don't like someone, they say, may you live in interesting times. And the last 2 years they've gone out of their way to make sure we live in interesting times. Well, did you have a good Christmas? And now a good New Year? Well, many people didn't. Tragedy hit many people. We've had funerals here. We know of Felicity's daughter in America. And on Friday we had a funeral here. A young man, 12 years old in our Sunday school, who died. We've had 2 years of virus lockdown. Millions have lost jobs due to the lockdown. Hundreds have committed suicide because of what the lockdown's done to them. Apparently, it's almost pandemic suicide in some places because the kids can't handle sitting at home all the time. I'm sure their parents can't handle them sitting at home as well. But they get so depressed, they kill themselves. Hundreds of people starved because governments didn't realize you can't switch an economy off and then switch it on again like a light. If you switch it off, things grind to a halt and you can't just switch on and it starts up again. It has to wind up. And all prices have gone up, especially petrol. But you can't get anything done at the traffic department or internal affairs because they're closed because of COVID. You have to pay taxes, but you can't get help from SARS because of COVID. At one stage, remember, you couldn't buy cooked chickens. You could buy them raw or frozen, but not cooked. I'm not sure what that's got to do with the virus. You couldn't buy open-toed shoes. I don't know what that's got to do with the virus either. Maybe athlete's foot, but not virus. You could gamble away your salary at a casino still, but you couldn't go to the beach. The highlight for me was when the police went to arrest someone fishing on the beach. This whole mob of police descended on him and someone had put up a dummy. I thought, give that man a bells. Sorry, no offense me. We're also this year facing the prospect of a war. Not here, hopefully, but in Ukraine and Poland. It's teetering on a knife edge, to use the old expression. And if there is a war, it is going to affect us down here, even if we're not fighting. Of course, there's a war in Mozambique, and the SANDF lost a soldier about a week ago with these Muslim terrorists. There's also an excellent chance in the Middle East of Israel attacking Iran because they're understandably nervous about being told they're going to be exterminated with a nuclear bomb. So they're a bit twitchy there. Russia's threatening to launch hypersonic missiles. These are things that travel at 6 times the speed of sound. There's no way you can stop them once they're launched. And the loony guy in North Korea is probably going to try and go nuclear in the coming year. But at the same time, in the White House, there's a patient, a guy who has to be told what to say by his handlers. We've also seen a rise in tyranny around the world. Australia has prison camps. People have been hauled off, put in prison camps, and they're not allowed out of the door of their hut. It doesn't hit the mainstream media, but that's happening. They also had forced injections of antivirus for Aboriginal people. You wonder why only the Aboriginal people. In Canada, they arrest pastors in the street and then fence off their churches so nobody can go to services. In fact, yesterday, The same pastor who was arrested before was arrested again because he is protesting outside the house of the Minister of Health. That sounds like the Soviet Union. And it's not just tyranny, there's a war on Christians and churches. I looked at the headlines on the internet this morning. There's attacks on Christians in Nigeria, Myanmar, India, Canada, of course, and several other places, targeted specifically at Christians, not just accidental ones. US and Ireland, pastors and evangelists get arrested. In the UK as well, evangelists are regularly arrested if they preach in the street. And in this country, a few years ago, a couple of, I call them gangsters, but troublemakers, reported the pastor of Joshua Generation Church for actually teaching what the Bible teaches, saying that what's in the Bible is true. And they got very upset about that and reported him to the Human Rights Commission. And here churches were closed, remember, because they were non-essential. I always wonder, how come some jobs are essential and others aren't? If it gives you an income and you can eat, that's an essential job. And I don't think politician is an essential job myself. We could get by without them. So churches were closed because they were not essential, but the abortion clinics were open because they're essential. Got to kill more children. And everything seems to be breaking down, and evil seems to be on the rise, and the church is on the defensive, and persecution is growing, and it's getting worse in the coming year. But a brief check reveals, yes, God is still in control. He's not letting anyone have any control. He's not been taken by surprise by anything. You know, so often we get surprised, but God's not surprised. There's a lovely story during the Cold War, in the 80s, you know, when America and Russia were rattling missiles at each other. One man in Canada had had enough of war, and he decided he was going to opt out, and he researched exhaustively around the world which area was least likely to be in a state of war. And he landed in the Falklands 2 weeks before the Argentinians invaded. I love that story. But you know, God knew that was going to happen. Everyone was taken by surprise except God. Well, now our text for today. You'd open your Bibles to Psalm 2. And Psalm says this: "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, 'Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us.' He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his fury and in his wrath, and terrify them in his fury, saying, 'As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." Well, the background for this psalm is probably one of the wars of Israel, when a vassal kingdom tried to break away. And so essentially, firstly, it refers to the king of Israel and to that war, whichever it was. However, it also foretells Christ, because David was Christ's and was God's anointed king, but he was also a forebear of Christ. You can trace the line of David right down to Christ. We generally in the West don't know anywhere past our grandparents or great-grandparents. But in some countries, most of Africa, and I know Mongolia, people know their generation, their ancestors back for 7 or so generations. And they're surprised when they find that Westerners don't know that. So it goes beyond the little kingdom of Israel under David and his successors. And there's some clues here that this is exactly what the psalm is about. It's about Christ and his rule and the opposition to Christ. And there are 4 speakers in this psalm. It breaks down into 4 parts. First, the psalmist speaks, and then God on his throne speaks a few verses. And then the anointed king or his son. And then finally the psalmist finishes off again. So I'm going to follow that outline. First, the psalmist. Here's a man, be it David or someone else, who asks a question in absolute astonishment. He's gobsmacked. Why do the nations rage and the rulers plot together? What on earth do they want to do that? And we might ask ourselves, why these days do people want to mock God? Why do they want to mock the Bible? It's astonishing. It's not a threat to them. Well, actually it is. It's a threat to their way of life. It's not as if they were taking a stand against a tyrant and you wish that they would take a stand against tyrants. No, they're taking a stand and shaking their fist at someone who wishes them well. Why do they rage, he asks. And then he says they plot or meditate in vain. And this is the same word used elsewhere, namely in Psalm 1, where it says, I've lost my specs here, I need a bigger print Bible. It says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners or in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates, same word, day and night. Here, people plot or meditate against God. They think up opposition to God. Is that they constantly consider God and his works and how they can take a stand against it. It's the negative side of the positive. They constantly think bad things about God and suspect him of evil. And one of our favorite atheists, he's not actually an atheist, Richard Dawkins, he takes God to task and calls him a what's it when you hate women? That. He calls him miserable and selfish and self-opinionated. Well, when you created the entire universe, maybe you got a right to be self-opinionated. And people do this continually. And often people claim to be atheists, but on examination you find they don't disbelieve in God, they just hate him for some reason. Just a reminder, Karl Marx himself was not an atheist. He was a Satan worshipper. He believed in God and he was taking a stand against him. Maybe these people didn't get their prayers answered. They prayed for something and it didn't come true. They prayed for a job and they didn't get it. They prayed to marry someone, but that person married someone else. They prayed for their mother or father to get well when they had cancer or something, and they didn't. So therefore now I have a case against God and I'll shake my fist at him. They didn't get what they wanted. Darwin himself, the man who wrote Origin of Species, and someone said, I think it was Time magazine, Darwin killed God. Time magazine's generally wrong. He himself was not an atheist, but he hated God because his daughter died. So this is a common thing, but quickly escalates to other levels if we look at verse 2 and 3. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. Well, it goes from personal to becoming an article of politics and statecraft. And we see, of course, we saw this in the Soviet Union, if you are old enough to remember the Soviet Union. We used to be terrified of the Soviet Union. Do you remember? When my sisters were at school, they got advice, if there's a nuclear attack, lie behind a low wall to escape the blast. Someone asked the teacher, do we actually want to survive in that case? But that's besides the point. And as I say, Marx himself was no atheist. He was a Satan worshipper. So too was Samora Machel of Mozambique. He was a Satanist, not an atheist. And Marx himself said, everything in society has to be seen as a class struggle. Everything is a class struggle. It's politics. And so you have a struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor. You have a struggle between the boss and the workers. And ultimately, if you follow it logically, you get a struggle between oppressed man and God the oppressor. That's the ultimate class struggle. And that's why it says, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. Evil people and those who don't trust Christ don't want God at all. And you'll find this very often. People will claim to be Christian, but they don't actually want God in their lives. They don't want God telling them what to do. They don't want to listen to the commandments of God, because that's irritating. That takes away our free will. We have to do what someone else says. And so they make idols. And the classic idol, if you want an example, was a man who died a few days ago, Desmond Tutu. And he said this, my God would never be homophobic, in other words, reject homosexuality. My God. And he was quite right. His God never would do that. The God in heaven's a little bit different. And it's not a new thing. If we go back to Genesis 11, we read this. As people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, now they're taking counsel together, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, come, let us, reasoning together, build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, taking their stand against God. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. In other words, we will not obey that command of God to spread out over the earth and repopulate it after the flood. We will set ourselves up and govern ourselves without reference to God. We don't need him. And it's not an accident, in fact, it was absolutely deliberate, that the EU Parliament is modeled on a painting of the Tower of Babel. It was deliberate. It's not coincidental that there's widespread persecution of the church in Europe. If I stood and preached this sermon pretty much in any pulpit in Europe, the police would come for me. We're not as bad off as we think sometimes. And while it's praised as enlightenment, we talk about the Enlightenment, which was nothing of the kind, or critical thinking, or some other foolish phrase, it's just common or garden rebellion, just the same old thing that's always gone on. They're not doing anything new. They're just giving it a coat of varnish. Next speaker is God himself. Well, he's in heaven. He's above the earth. He's not earthly. He's completely unlike anything on the earth. We can't even comprehend a hundredth of what God is like. And that's why people make idols, carve out something that represents God, except it doesn't represent God at all, except in the tiniest sort of way. So unearthly and so unlike us, we can't comprehend him at all unless he shows part of himself to us. Do you know that? You cannot possibly understand God without him giving you the understanding. How's that for a humbling thought? No enlightenment there, or no critical thinking. You are stuck in your sin, in your darkness, unless God breaks in. Rex Matthew used to give us the example of a scientist looking down a microscope. Now you can put a slide under a microscope and watch all these bugs dancing around. But if you put God under a microscope, you would see nothing unless he let you see. What does it say? God laughs. Here's these people, proud as anything, and he holds these little rebels in derision. Now, an illustration may help, and I had this from someone else. I saw this. We go back to the Tower of Babel. Now, these people were very proud of their achievement and their efforts and their declaration of independence from God. They were proud of the tower, which was a temple, reached up into the heavens. They didn't need God to come down to them. They were going up into the heavens themselves with an idol in it. It was at that stage the biggest, strongest, most massive, most magnificent, impressive structure ever built. Okay, we've surpassed it now. Skyscrapers in New York, apparently the London Shard, I think they call it, is very impressive. There's impressive buildings all over, but at that time, that was the biggest, most impressive, most immovable structure in the world that had ever been built. And they brag about it, and the way it sounds is God then, and we turn him into a man here, we anthropomorphize. They've got their huge structure and they're bragging about it, and God hears about it, and he comes down. It's as if he comes down and he has to say, what are you guys doing down here? You see the difference? As if God has to get out a microscope almost to see their magnificent efforts and their structure and their parades. And that is why God laughs long and loud at them. And he must, in a sense, find all of this, all of human history, the struggling for independence, hilarious. I mean, we look back at history and sometimes we find it hilarious, like the guy who went to the Falklands to avoid war, or other stories. Prophet Isaiah says that kings and nations, far from being impressive, they're like a drop in the bucket. You know, when you empty out a bucket, you might shake it and another drop comes out. Or dust on the scales. Those of you who do baking, you have a scale that, I don't know, my mom had an aluminium sort of funny shaped thing that sat on top. It didn't matter if there was a bit of flour left on it from the last baking. It wasn't going to make any difference to the recipe. Kings and kingdoms, republics, if you like, empires, they're like dust on the scales as far as God's concerned. That's why I always like to say, do you remember the Soviet Union? Covered a huge expanse of the earth. They had 7 time zones. And they had tentacles all over the world. Well, that's gone. If some of us were a bit older, I'd say, do you remember the Roman Empire? Well, that's gone as well. And so we love to make fun of politicians. Uncle Joe in the White House, or Squirrel up in Pretoria. What's this other guy? Charlie, the one with the hat. And sometimes I feel that for them to be objects of fun at least justifies their existence. You know, we could at least get a laugh out of some of them. And you have to ask, really? These guys want to take on God? They want to shake their little fists and squeak at him? Do they know who they're up against? They want independence. Well, how about they stop breathing the oxygen God created? or using the plants and animals he created, or living by all the laws of physics and biological processes he created. There's a lovely joke about a scientist saying, I can do anything God did. And God takes up the challenge and says, okay, create life. And he says, well, first you take these chemicals. And God says, hold on a minute. You make your own chemicals. These are mine. Oh, it's not so easy then. And so anyone trying to live independently of God or thinking rebellion in his heart is a fool. It's like someone on hallucinogenic drugs, LSD or something like that, and they start seeing things that aren't there. Or people who drink so much that they see pink elephants. They're imagining things. And these people demanding freedom and thinking for themselves or enlightened are entirely deluded, and so they are mocked. God scoffs at them. You know, think of the great kings of the time. Henry VIII. We don't even know where he's buried. Or Queen Elizabeth I, or I don't know, one of the Tsars of Russia. The Emperor Montezuma in Central America. Pick anyone, and they're nothing. They're gone. They're dust. But it doesn't stop there. Verse 5, we read this. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. You see, people like this can expect more than derision. They can expect fury. Those little people in Babylon, in Shinar, who were so proud of their tower and their achievements and their fist shaking and squeaking, really? God's going to put up with that? He's going to put up with people making idols and saying, this is God? No, he won't. And since God is so mighty and so untouchable, and men are so frail, this is wrath and fury that cannot be withstood. At one point in the history of Israel, the people decided they wanted a king rather than a judge or prophet over them representing God. They wanted a king. They wanted to be like all the other nations, which was a thing that could never be, in fact. And in effect, God said, if you want a king, I'll give you a king. And they got Saul, an imperfect, flawed man who led Israel astray and got them involved in unnecessary wars which were lost. Now there is another king, not a human being, not an Israelite king. It says he set his king on Mount Zion. This is a prophesied king. The kings weren't anointed on Mount Zion. David wasn't anointed on Mount Zion, and nor was Solomon. But this is a king on Mount Zion. And so we go on to the third speaker, the king who speaks. And the third speaker, of course, is the Son, installed on Mount Zion. And verse 7 is quoted in the letter to the Hebrews. The writer strives to show the greatness and uniqueness of Christ, and he uses this verse that says, you are my Son. Nobody else has ever heard that uttered by God. Yes, if we become Christians, we become sons of God, but we're sons by adoption. This is a son who's begotten. This is a son who is part of God. Sorry. And no one who's ever heard that, and it's a decree, it's something decided on and announced by and enforced by God. It's a statute, a law, it's something that can't be questioned. You can't argue about it. I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. And we sometimes forget this. The kingdom of God, I know as a church we have a democracy, we vote on issues, but the kingdom of God is not a multi-party democracy. It's a ruthless dictatorship. There's one person in charge and you do what he says. He's more fearsome than any emperor. You do exactly what he says, or trouble ensues. And one day anyway, you'll bow before him. Then verse 8, we see this. Ask of me, And I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. Now, when we think of nations, what do we think of? Lines on a map, different colored countries, right? I mentioned the Soviet Union. For some reason, on all our maps, it was a sort of a lime green, covered most of the map. Or if you get an older map, you find the British Empire, and most of the world is red. Well, that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is people groups, or goyim, as the Hebrew word says. The Jews call us Gentiles goys. The goyim, the nations, the people groups, the tribes. And right away, we can make some associations. Revelation 7 verse 9 says this, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches before their hands." And there's another one. I think we'll come to it, or we did come to it actually with Henry. John chapter 10 verse 16. "I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd." Did you notice something? If you look around you, we're not all of the same flock. Is anyone with Scots ancestors? No. Irish? Where'd your ancestors come from, Dougie? Yeah, well, you can come and say thank you, because we Irish actually invented Scotland. The word Scot comes from Latin scotus, which means an Irishman, because we invaded and took over the place, and we'd already invented whiskey and bagpipes, by the way. But we see different sheep, if you like, around us. One day I had a Nigerian man come into the shop, and his eye fell on a book we have called The Greatest Century of Missions, and it's got pictures of different missionaries from the 19th century on it. And he saw the picture of Mary Slessor of Calabar on it. Now, Mary Slessor was born into a poverty-stricken family. She slept on the floor, began work at 10 years old. Anyone with 10 years old? Who's 10 years old? 9. Well, you're 9 years old. You're nearly 10. She had to go and work in a mill for about 12 hours a day from 10 years old. You've got it easy. She had 2 brothers who dedicated themselves to becoming missionaries, but they died. And so she resolved to take their place and sailed for Calabar, which is the coast in Nigeria. And she established schools and churches. She brought to an end the killing of twins. Hey, we've got twins here. Where's the twins? Yeah. You know, if you'd been born in Nigeria, probably halfway through the 18th century, you would have been dumped in the forest for the animals to take, because twins are evil, okay? Remember that. Twins are evil. But she put an end to that. And she put an end to the practice of slave trading. And so he said, we honor her memory in Nigeria because of what she did. Similarly, the people from Zambia can bear witness. David Livingstone. They got 2 towns named after David Livingstone, and an airport as well, I think. You know, never mind getting rid of colonial influences and so on. They honor David Livingstone. Joseph, you live near Blantyre. What's Blantyre named after? Blantyre. Where does that name come from? It's where David Livingstone was born. And they honor him there as well. And all of this is part of this prophecy, that all tribes and tongues will bow down and worship the King. Sheep from another flock other than Israel will come and bow down. People from every nation and tribe and tongue are the inheritance of Christ. They and we are what he gets from his Father. And so you've got to struggle. Be a good inheritance. Did you see the words of the first hymn we sang? What we can do in the coming year? And the picture I had up, maybe Ollie can pop it up again, with Charles Spurgeon. I hope we gave glory to God in the last year. Let's make sure we give him glory as his inheritance in the new year. Then verse 9 goes on, and now it's a strange verse. It says this: "You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." Well, having said this about the peoples of the earth, he carries on like this. In other words, he's going to smash nations and kingdoms. We've got a piece of pottery here. I thought briefly of bringing an iron rod and whacking it, but I thought, no, that won't go down well. But that's the picture he uses. You've got a pot made by a potter, and someone comes with this iron bar and gives it a whack, and it's smashed into little fragments. And he says, well, that's how nations and kingdoms are going to go. They're going to go like cheap pottery. And if you read the book of Daniel, there's that statue representing all the different kingdoms and empires, the Persian and the Medo-Persian and the Babylonian Empire and the Roman Empire, and they're smashed. And the wind blows them away. And those of us who are a bit older have seen empires come and go. The 1,000-year Reich of Hitler. It's going to last 1,000 years. I think they managed, 20? It doesn't do to mock God. But why a rod of iron? Don't kings have golden scepters? Well, iron was a symbol of power. It was the strongest, hardest thing available. They didn't have steel back in those days. And so you'll read, if you read in the book of Judges, invaders like Philistines, it says they had chariots of iron. They were superior. They had armored vehicles. And there was a time when Israel didn't have iron, and they had to go into the Philistines to get ox goads and sickles and things sharpened and repointed. They didn't have iron swords to resist. Iron was power that couldn't be resisted. There's nothing you could do against an iron weapon. And so too here, there will be no resistance. And kingdoms are like cheap clay pottery smashed with a rod of iron. And there are three references to this in the book of Revelation. It says Christ will rule with a rod of iron, smashing the kingdoms of his enemies, and as we've said, that has already happened. But see this, chapter 2, verse 24 in Revelation. He speaks to people like us in a church in Thyatira, just ordinary vanilla Christians going about their day, being persecuted a bit. He says this: "To the rest of you in Thyatira who do not hold to this evil teaching, who have not learned what some call the deep things of Satan, to you I say, I do not lay on any other burden. Only hold fast to what you have until I come." And then he says, "The one who conquers and who keeps my works to the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father." You see that? People who are in God's household, God's kingdom, part of God's flock, they suddenly get authority in judging kingdoms and smashing them to pieces. One wonders what the poor Christians in North Korea are going to do to the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. You wonder what the Christians persecuted in Pakistan are going to do to the Pakistani government or the Indian government or the Burmese government, because that's going to happen. They're going to be the ones to carry out the judgment of Christ. And finally, we go back to the psalmist in verse 10 to 12. And he says, "Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way." Having recited the foolishness of rebellion and the mockery of God and the rule of his Son, he offers a bit of advice, and everyone needs to hear this. On Friday, we had the funeral of Chris Kalunga. Some of you were here. Yeah. And Henry gave an invitation. Be reconciled to God while you can. I asked to ask the question, when are you going to die? Do you know the date you're going to die? We've got the pamphlets, they were down here. Chris Kalunga, I think he was born in 2009 to 2021. When are you going to die? Well, you don't know. Now, reasonably, the young people probably will live longer than most of us, but some of them won't, as we saw. Time runs out like that, and you don't know when you're going to die. Time is running out for each one of us, and one day it will be your body or my body in the coffin in front here. And then it's too late to change. Then it's too late to turn to God. So he says, do it while you can. And there's some tracts at the back there, at Auntie Felicity's table. Grab hold of one, read about it. There's one called 1 Second After You Die. What happens after that? Kings and rulers need to be warned. When a nation has an ungodly ruler, the decline of the entire country is inevitable and visible. Not even the media can hide this. Country declines. If you see a country in decline, you see its roads breaking up into potholes, and crime is rampant, and hospitals not functioning, and the supermarket shelves empty, then you can be certain it has ungodly rulers, like symptoms of a disease. And that is why when you pray for the government, as we did this morning, you need to actually pray for the fear of God to fall on all of them. From the top down to the guy who serves you at the counter at the traffic department here, or at the city municipality over here in Plumstead. You need to pray that they actually begin to fear God. And they need to know that they must serve and fear God. And it's not just the rulers. It says, kiss the Son. Be reconciled to the Son he has placed over the earth as ruler. Well, we just had Christmas. What do we sing at Christmas? Peace on earth. And someone cynically remarked that after 2,000 years of peace on earth, this was the First World War poet, we've got as far as poison gas. See, it's got nothing to do with the ending of wars between countries. It has to do with the ending of war between each person and God. Believe it or not, if you're not of God's flock, if you have not trusted Christ at this stage, you are at war with God, the same God that scoffs at magnificent rulers and temples and buildings. You're at war. Peace between countries can only happen when most of the people have been reconciled to God. There can be no brotherhood of man, as we used to like to sing about in the 60s, without the fatherhood of God. And so the psalmist finishes with these glorious words. Blessed is everyone who takes refuge in him. What's the corollary of that? Cursed is everyone who doesn't take refuge in him. Well, this is where we'll finish. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him for the new year. And a brief check indicates, yes, God is still in absolute control. He's in absolute control of the country and of your life and your steps, your job. And he's in absolute control of the president and the president of the US and the situation in Ukraine. Yes, he's got it all under control and nothing slips through his fingers. There are two kinds of people. Those who submit themselves and their way of life to God, and those who shake their fists at him and try and ignore him. Two ways of living. Submission to God and his commands, or submission to their own evil desires. I want what I want, when I want it. There's two destinations. The inheritance of Christ, the Son of God, as part of his flock, submitting to the king, or as his enemies, smashed with a rod of iron. And this is the word of God.